I'm Casey Briggs. The Prime Minister has put Australia's largest ever peacetime operation on a so-called war footing, assembling the National Cabinet twice weekly from Monday in an effort to right the vaccination ship. With limitations on the use of AstraZeneca's vaccine in Australia and the bulk of the nation's Pfizer orders not set to arrive until late in the year, timelines have blown out for the country's vaccination campaign. States have been pushing for mass vaccination hubs to help deliver doses quickly, and the government's signalled a new openness to the idea. They've been a success in countries like the US, but doctors aren't sure they'll help here yet.
The state vaccination centres aren't actually going to be very big to start with because there isn't much vaccine for them to give out. We get 130-odd thousand doses per week of the Pfizer at the moment. That is going to increase later in the year, but there's no point having a mass clinic and a very small amount of vaccine to deliver.
As of Friday morning, around 1.4 million vaccine doses had been administered across the country. We're now seeing a 7-day average of around 52,000 doses a day, and that's about the same as it was a week ago. The government says its focus is now on vaccinating those for whom there are no barriers to getting AstraZeneca, people aged over 50. That includes most residential aged care recipients. As of Friday morning, roughly 165,000 jabs had been given to them, but most are yet to get a dose. As for aged care workers, almost none of them are yet vaccinated. At this point, there's no timeline for the completion of Phase 1A of the rollout. The United States is now getting through more than 3.3 million doses a day on average, getting close to 200 million doses in total. All up, 38% of the population has had at least a first dose. But it too has suffered a setback. This week it paused its rollout of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, again over blood clotting concerns. That's a speed bump on the US rollout, but probably not on the scale we're now experiencing in Australia. Johnson & Johnson doses make up less than 4% of all the United States vaccines given to date. We've got no Johnson & Johnson jabs on order in Australia, but the government this week ruled out chasing it, partly because it works in a similar way to the AstraZeneca one. There are fears it could have the same side effects.
A rare but fatal clotting syndrome linked to the AstraZeneca vaccine has wreaked havoc on Australia's vaccine rollout. Now regulators suspect other vaccines may also cause clotting.
Johnson & Johnson has had about 1 in 2 million clots. It's potentially rarer than what we've seen with AstraZeneca.
Among the Australian vaccines, the single-shot Johnson & Johnson is most similar to the 2-shot AstraZeneca vaccine. They're both adenovirus-based vaccines, while the Pfizer is an mRNA vaccine. mRNA vaccines use a piece of single-stranded RNA to produce the protein spikes on the surface of the coronavirus. The RNA is wrapped in a fatty bubble, which enters your cells and gets them to produce the spikes. Critically, when cells in the immune system latch onto those spikes, they create antibodies that are able to disable the coronavirus if it comes along. The AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccines use double-stranded DNA. They package it in the mostly harmless shell of an adenovirus, which is also able to enter human cells.
Adenoviruses themselves, which circulate naturally in the population, have actually been associated with some changes in clotting.
But side effects aren't limited to adenovirus-based vaccines, and experts say the public needs to learn how to evaluate the risks.
They all come with side effects, from the minor, irritating ones of soreness to the more severe ones.
Side effects we'll need to weigh up and watch out for. Michael Slezak, ABC News.
We're joined now by Dr. Norman Swan, host of the Coronacast podcast and the Health Report on RN. Good to see you, Norman.
Hi, Casey.
What does this Johnson & Johnson pause mean in the US, and why have they stopped administering them entirely, rather unlike what we've seen here in Australia with AstraZeneca?
So it's quite serious for the United States in terms of its implications because they were relying on the Johnson vaccine to immunise disadvantaged populations. So in the United States, there's been a disparity in how the immunisation campaign has rolled out. So it's gone, people in wealthier, better educated suburbs, where people have got more access to healthcare and are able to actually draw down and get appointments, they've immunised quite well. but it's down as low as 20% in some disadvantaged communities. And therefore, you double the problem if you've got a two-dose vaccine. So a single-dose vaccine is incredibly useful. And that's the main concern that they've got. So it's a very easy to administer one-dose vaccine. The pause is not a permanent pause. The CDC had a meeting the other day, I think Wednesday or Thursday Australian time, and the pause is for them to actually just analyse the data. Remember, they haven't got experience of this. We've been able to tell doctors in Australia how to look for this, how it presents, what tests to do. They haven't done that in the United States, so they're not prepared. They haven't prepared the ground, and also how to treat it and how not to treat it, because they haven't been using Astra. The second thing that they're doing is looking at the same thing as our authorities did last week, which is what are the benefits versus the risks, and where, like Britain or Australia, would you say that you would or would not vaccinate there, what restrictions you'd put on it. So they're asking for 7 to 14 days just to sort that out. And
sort out the risk profile of the United States.
Yeah, so in other words, it will go on back on the market or go back into distribution, but there will be almost certainly an age restriction like Australia. Just what age do they put that is the issue.
Greg Hunt was this week asked about timelines and milestones for reopening alongside the vaccination campaign. Let's just have a listen to what he said.
Vaccination alone is no guarantee that you can open up. And this was a discussion that, in fact, I had with Professor Murphy in just the last 24 hours, that if the whole country were vaccinated, you couldn't just open the borders. We still have to look at a series of different factors: transmission, longevity, and the global impact.
So, Norman, what do you make of that? I think most Australians probably expected when you get to the point of widespread vaccination, well, that would be sufficient to start seeing international travel again.
It depends on the risk appetite of the community. So remember, and you're the one who knows these statistics better than me, but it's a fraction of 1%, tiny fraction of 1% of Australians who've been infected so far. So even if we were to immunise 90% of Australians, we've still got 10% of Australians who haven't, and that's maybe 100 times more than people have been already infected. And if it was a variant, it could even be worse, coming in, then the vaccine may not be effective at all, or minorly effective. So these are important issues. However, the evidence coming in from overseas is that transmission is reduced, particularly with the Pfizer vaccine. It's likely with the Astra vaccine too. And that means when you've got 90% of the community immunised, there's less virus around in the community. So it's a bit like measles and the other vaccines that we already use. It's not so much herd immunity, it's more that there's just much less virus around, and the likelihood of transmission is much lower. And so I think that evidence base is emerging. The wild card is variants. That's the wild card.
Dr. Norman Swan, thanks so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Well, Australia mercifully hasn't found concerning local transmission inside our borders in around a fortnight, but the virus is continuing to spread aggressively across the world.
In January and February, the world saw 6 consecutive weeks of declining cases. We have now seen 7 consecutive weeks of increasing cases and 4 weeks of increasing deaths. Last week was the 4th highest number of cases in a single week so far.
And that growth in cases is happening across the globe. Thailand has this week set new daily records for coronavirus cases after an outbreak seeded in entertainment venues in the capital, Bangkok. So far, just 0.1% of people in the country are vaccinated. In Japan, cases are surging, and even with less than 100 days to go, government officials have left open the option of cancelling the already postponed Olympic Games. We're also seeing cases surging in parts of Europe, including in France. Just over 5.5% of the French population is fully vaccinated. But some of the biggest case numbers are currently being recorded in Brazil and India. These two countries are reporting more than 30% of the world's cases at the moment. And again, neither of those countries is particularly advanced in their vaccination campaigns. Brazil's been using a combination of AstraZeneca doses and one of the vaccines being produced in China, at least as many doses as it can get its hands on, while India is in the grips of a major coronavirus catastrophe with more than 200,000 new cases recorded in a 24-hour period. That brings the country's total to more than 14 million. Its health system is under severe pressure and there are shortages of beds and oxygen. It comes as millions of Hindu pilgrims make their way to the world's largest religious festival, Kumbh Mela. Vaccines from China and Russia are being used across much of South America as well as in Africa and Asia. And we're starting to get more information on the real-world effectiveness of these vaccines. For more on that, we're joined by Professor Robert Boy from the University of Sydney and the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance. Professor Boy, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So we saw very little, Professor, in the way of clinical trial data from some of these vaccines, particularly the ones from China. Are we getting a clearer idea now on their effectiveness?
Well, it's really helpful to have strong evaluation done on the basis of large numbers, real-world experience in places like Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey. The trials done with one of the Chinese vaccines suggested at least 80% protection in Turkey, but then when they were done in both Brazil and Indonesia, it was only about 50%, which is quite worrying. It's adequate, but it's unlikely to lead to herd immunity if you use it even very widely.
Does that lower effectiveness also mean it takes a lot longer to get control of the pandemic? Does that have consequences for all of us?
No, absolutely. If in countries with a lot of disease like Brazil, up to 20% of people get immunity from disease, that still leaves 80% who need to be vaccinated. If you vaccinate all of that 80% with a vaccine that's only 50% effective, that means only half of them will get protected. So 20% from disease, 40% from vaccine, that's not enough for herd immunity. You will still get transmission, even more so now that the variants of concern have become more transmissible and require even higher rates of immunity to get herd immunity.
We've seen, common fears around blood clots linked now to both the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines. Like those two vaccines, Russia's Sputnik V is also an adenovirus viral vector vaccine. Do you know if there have been any concerns raised about blood clots in that vaccine?
No, I'm not aware of any concerns in particular with Sputnik V. It's obviously two different adenovirus vectors given in succession. It has the same theoretical risk, but the practical risk is still being investigated. There's a handful of countries using the vaccine widely. There's probably at least 30 countries that have registered it and are about to use it widely. So we'll get that kind of real-world experience quite soon, within the next few weeks. The report for the Johnson & Johnson product is very preliminary. Only 1 in a million appear to have the problem. And so that is under close and further investigation in the US.
The AstraZeneca pauses that we've seen around the world have largely been in developed countries. I wonder, Professor Boy, if we're likely to see consequences of that across the developing world. There are more than 100 countries in the developing world using these vaccines. What's the knock-on effect there?
Well, vaccine confidence is really important for people to feel comfortable to go and get their jab. And when we have some people losing their confidence, cancelling their appointments, they're waiting for more information, they're waiting for reassurance, they're waiting for better and more reassuring data information. So I think that's going to come, but the impact on both developing and developing countries could be extensive. The information highway is certainly going through developing countries too, and they're taking notice of problems, and they don't want to be shortchanged with the vaccine that the developing world is pausing about.
I wonder if the world would be better off as a whole if we took some of those vaccines that are being hoarded by the first world, the Pfizer and the Moderna jabs, and delivered them to regions that are more aggressively being threatened by variants of concern.
Yeah, that's such a great proposition. But countries look after their own, they're selfish. But Australia is reaching out to the South Pacific, and our TGA has offered with the regulation requirements for evaluating vaccines if South Pacific countries want that help. And Australia has also offered to share 1 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccine with Papua New Guinea and is likely to share many more doses with other countries in our neighbourhood.
Professor Robert Boy, thank you so much for your insights.
You're welcome.
And that's the show for this week. Join us every Friday at this time. Bye for now.
Don't touch that dial.